Hey y'all, as a pelvic floor physical therapist, one of the things that I see all too often is how frustrating it can be for runners when unwanted leaking or poor bladder control really gets in the way of you being able to enjoy your runs. So today we're going to talk about some things that you can pay attention to and that you can start working on to decrease that symptom of leaking or peeing while you run. Before we jump into it, my name is Amanda. I'm a doctor of physical therapy and I specialize in pelvic floor therapy. I especially work with women through pregnancy and postpartum, and in my physical therapy practice, I've helped hundreds of women go back to the activities and the exercises that they love without pain or pelvic floor symptoms like unwanted leaking or poor bladder control, especially for runners. So a lot of what we're going to talk about today are things that I do regularly with real people that get real people results for what we're talking about. One of the first things that I want you to start to pay attention to when you're on your runs is your posture. And when I say posture, what I really mean is your stacking. So if we think about our body as really made up of a stack of blocks, what we want is for our blocks to be stacked in a way that sets our body up for success, more specifically that sets our pressure management system up for success, which is our core and our pelvic floor. So when we have stress incontinence, the kind of incontinence that you get whenever you are on a run and you have poor bladder control, that is a pressure management problem. It means that we aren't managing pressure well, and that pressure is getting dumped down into the bladder, and the pressure is winning, and the pelvic floor and the core can't control it. So if we can stack the system in a more efficient pattern, especially while you're running, it actually goes a really long way in decreasing that symptom, even before you've gotten better strength in your core and your pelvic floor. So a lot of people think about just plain old, if I'm leaking, I must need to get stronger somewhere. And that might be the case, but it also might not be, because I have seen where people can have a really, really strong core and a really strong pelvic floor, but if we don't have the system set up to manage pressure well, it doesn't matter how strong the muscles are, the pressure is just going to win no matter what. And so when we look for stacking, especially in runners, the blocks that I see get unstacked the most or have the biggest effect on symptoms while you run like this, one is your head and your neck. So I want you to feel whenever you're running, do you start to fall into this really like chin up forward head pattern? I see that happen a lot with especially distance runners when they start to get tired at the end of their run. And so if you're starting to fall into that lazy head and neck position where nothing is really stabilizing or controlling the head and neck anymore, that just sets your body up. The rest of your upper body kind of follows that posture, and it starts to put more pressure than necessary down into the pelvic floor and down into your bladder. The same can be true for your rib cage, and often these go hand in hand. So if you start to really clamp down on your rib cage or get into that forward shoulder posture where you feel your rib cage really starting to clamp down, that's another example of something that we're unstacking the blocks, which is then putting a lot of pressure down into your bladder and not setting your system up for success. But the two can really go together, like I said. So if you feel that head start to creep forward, and you can even see it, let's see if I turn to the side. As that head starts to creep forward, notice how my trunk and my rib cage really fall down too. And so these two patterns can go together, but you could also have one without the other. With stacking, I want you to especially pay attention to what's happening with it if you know that your leaking is linked to a specific situation. So I've had runners before say, I'm totally fine when I start running, but I reach mile 4, and then that's where I start to get symptoms. And I say, okay, I want you to really check in with yourself, and we are checking a bunch of other things. So we're looking at breathing, we're looking at running mechanics, we're looking at hip stability stuff, but I'll say, I want you to check in with your posture and your stacking just before you reach that 4-mile mark and see what's starting to happen. And if it's just a problem with now you're fatigued, now you're getting to that distance where your system is okay, now we're really pushing it, and you're starting to get a little bit lazy with how you're stacked, then that's something that's really easily fixable as long as we bring attention to it, and that can really be helpful. Another example of a specific situation is uphill or downhill. So I'll have runners that'll say, if I'm running on an incline or a decline, that's when I start to get symptoms. Usually it's one or the other. Sometimes it can be both, but they're totally fine on flat ground. That's another time where I'll say, we'll see what that incline or that decline decline did to your stacking. Because if your body is just doing something funky in reaction to the fact that you're running on an incline or a decline, then that is an easy fix. Again, as long as we bring awareness to it and pay attention to it and just keep the system stacked when we're on that incline or that decline, that can completely fix the symptoms or at least make them significantly better. If you want to learn more about this whole stacking idea and how it applies in other areas of life as well, but also just a little bit more about what you can do as a runner and other blocks that you need to pay attention to, that is a piece of the new webinar that I just launched. And so it's a free 1-hour core and pelvic floor class, 3 things that you can start doing right away to strengthen your core and your pelvic floor. And stacking is a big piece of what we talk about. So if you want to learn a little bit more about that, plus some other information on supporting your core and your pelvic floor support, then make sure you check the link in the description of this video and you can sign up to get access to that class. The second thing that I want you to start thinking about if you're a runner and you're not already doing this is your single leg strength and your single leg stability. I think what a lot of runners tend to forget is that running is a single leg activity. So running is essentially, we can boil it down to a single leg hop over and over and over again. We're never in that double leg stance. We're always either in single leg, so one foot on the ground, or we're in a flight phase where we're switching feet and then that other foot is on the ground. So it's a lot more complex than that, but if we wanted to boil it down to its simplest form, we're doing a single leg hop over and over and over again. And when our body is doing something in single leg, we need this big combination of, especially in running or something like a single leg hop, we need this combination of hip strength, leg strength, core strength, pelvic floor strength that all works together to keep us nice and neutral and stable over a single leg. But we also need really great force absorption. We also need really good power when we're pushing off from a single leg. And so a lot goes into it. But if any of those things are falling apart, all of those things are much easier in double leg and get way more complex and harder to do correctly in a single leg pattern. And so if we aren't training that regularly, if we aren't strengthening that and making sure that we're keeping up with all of those pieces of the puzzle, then that can really carry over when we're on our runs to having a really unstable pelvis or a system that doesn't know how to absorb force whenever our foot hits the ground, if we don't have both feet on the ground, if we just have one foot. All of those are examples, again, of it's not necessarily about your pelvic floor not being strong enough to control your bladder. It's more about we don't have the system set up for your pelvic floor to be successful, because all of that has to happen in order for your pelvic floor to have a chance to manage that pressure that comes with running in a single leg activity, to have a chance to manage and control your bladder. So if you're not already doing it, looking at some strength training that gets you into single leg positions like single leg box squats, rear foot elevated split squats, single leg hip hinges or RDLs, all of that can be really helpful to just make sure that you're working on how you stabilize and how you control things in a single leg position, and to strengthen the muscles that will help you do that. The other piece that comes with single leg stability is hip strength and hip control. A lot of the muscles that are surrounding your hips are also what's in charge of keeping that single leg in a neutral position when it's your base of support that the rest of your body, that your pelvic floor and your pelvis are over. And those are the same muscles that help stabilize your pelvis side to side. So if we're getting a hip drop every single time we are standing on one leg, either with both legs or just one, we're essentially stretching or straining the pelvic floor every single time we're in that position. And then that just makes it really ineffective for it to do its job, even if it's strong enough to do it in the first place. So really looking into, I know it's hard to talk runners into doing cross training, but that's one of the biggest examples of why it's so important to do cross training, but to do specific cross training that strengthens you for the activity that you want. And single leg strength training and single leg control and stability is huge for runners, and especially huge for preparing your pelvic floor for what it needs to be able to do while you're running. The third and last thing thing that I want you to start to pay attention to if you are a runner and you are having bladder leaks while you're on your run is relaxing your belly and your pelvic floor. And that can be so hard to talk people into doing and to get your system to do that for you, because especially if you have had a long history of this, the tendency is going to be to want to tighten everything up and hold it in all the time. So holding our belly in, holding our pelvic floor contracted or in a Kegel at all times while we're on our run, because intuitively that makes sense, right? Intuitively, it's like, well, my pelvic floor isn't controlling my bladder, so if I hold it really strong all the time, then it's going to control my bladder better. But there's a few things that are wrong with that. The first thing is that when we're holding muscles in all the time, over time, they're getting weaker and weaker and weaker, because in order to get stronger, a muscle needs to lengthen and contract and lengthen and shorten over and over and over again. That's what gets a muscle stronger and keeps it strong in the first place. So if we're just holding on to it all the time, it's getting weaker over time. But also, especially when we're running and walking, but especially running, is a very complex activity for our pelvic floor. So not only is it managing pressure, it's also absorbing force. It's also coming in to support us and give us stability, and it's doing all of those jobs at once, which means that it's having to coordinate between lengthening and shortening and bracing under our breath and all of these complex ideas, and it's having to combine and do it all at once, and we could almost never mimic that. There's no way that we could consciously make sure that the pelvic floor and all of the muscles that help the pelvic floor do its job are doing that on a run as quickly as it needs to happen all together at the same time. It's just this really complex coordination pattern that we're never meant to do purposefully. It was meant to be very automatic and very happening in the background. And so when we hold on to these muscles and squeeze our tummy and squeeze our pelvic floor and whatever else you might be squeezing while you're running, when we're doing that, we're interrupting that cycle. We're interrupting those automatic patterns that have to happen for us to have good bladder control and good support from our core and our pelvic floor. So when you're running, I want you to start to notice, do you have gripping patterns? First and foremost in day-to-day life, because that might actually be happening more in day-to-day life and then carrying over into running, and it would be really hard to stop it while you're running and still be doing it in day-to-day life. That would be near impossible. So when you're living your day-to-day life, or maybe when you're doing some of your other workouts, if you are a runner that does other stuff too, I want you to start to catch yourself. Are we glute gripping? Are we ab gripping? Are we walking around all day trying to suck our stomachs in or hold it in because we are embarrassed of our bellies? We just need to let our muscles do their jobs appropriately by leaving them relaxed so that they can do their jobs, and we aren't interrupting that by squeezing them all day long. But then especially when you're on your runs, I want you to check in with yourself periodically and see, okay, am I starting to hold my belly in? Am I holding my pelvic floor clenched? Do I need to stop for a minute and shake it out and maybe do a couple stretches, breathe into everything, get it opened up again, and then keep running? And then especially when you feel your symptoms. So if you start to feel your symptoms, or again, you know that you're like, when I reach mile whatever, that's when my symptoms start to pop up, or when I'm on an incline or a decline, or when I leave the road and I get onto trail running, whatever that looks like. If those are times where you know your symptoms pop up, check in, because it might also be a time that you have a habit of starting to naturally clench some muscles, especially your belly and your pelvic floor. And if that's the case, then we just need to practice leaving those muscles relaxed and get into a new habit of leaving them relaxed and leaving them able to do their job. So that's all I have for you today. Again, if you're interested in learning more about how to make sure that your system is set up for your core and your pelvic floor to do their job automatically in the background, that is everything that we're going over in that free webinar that I mentioned. So that free 1-hour core and pelvic floor class goes much more into depth in a lot of the topics that I just talked about, or a lot of the points that I just talked about today. And so it's all about just setting up your system to support you really well and to have really natural, good core and pelvic floor strength, even in activities like running. So if this is something that you're struggling with and you want to learn more about it, make sure to check out that link in the description so that you can get access to that free class. I hope this was so helpful for you, and I will see you next week.